Welcome to the Philadelphia Inquirer Spring Training Preview. I'm Scott Lauber alongside my colleagues Matt Breen and Bob Brookover. And guys, we're headed down to Clearwater for spring training, and I think one of the major topics that we're going to be looking at is their pitching. I think it was their weakness last season all year long, over and above everything else, specifically their starting pitching. But, you know, with the addition of Zach Wheeler, they feel like they'll be stronger at the top. I think the question is, did they do enough? Do they have enough pitching heading into the season to realistically look at them and say they are better than they were at the end of last year? They are better than a fourth-place team in the NL East. Matt?
Yeah, I remember when Hangover 2, and stay with me for a second. Hangover 2 came out. I was real excited to see it because Hangover 1 was a great comedy movie. Sitting there in the theater, watching it, and as the movie goes along, you're like, I think I've seen this movie before. Some different characters, but pretty much the exact same plot line, the same finish to the movie. And that's how I feel with Phillies pitching. It's the same movie. We've seen this movie before. We've seen Nick Pivetta. We've seen Vince Velasquez. We've seen Zach Eflin. They did not do enough to upgrade this rotation. But it's the same thing. We're going to go into spring training next week, and we're going to hear about how excited the Phillies are about these guys taking the next step, turning it around. Could have said the exact same thing last year. We've seen this movie, and I could be wrong, but I'm not going to go in there expecting this is the year that these guys turn it around. I just think they did not do enough. Yes, they got Zach Wheeler, but you needed that second pitcher because now you have Eflin and Pivetta / Velasquez in your rotation, where I think you just needed to have one of them. Having two of them it's a too big of a burden to carry.
I'm going to give a shout out to Bill Murray and Ned Ryerson for not doing a sequel to Groundhog Day.
They did a commercial, though.
Well, they did a commercial, but anybody can do a commercial. I agree with Matt that they have not done enough. And the really disappointing part about it to me is there were opportunities in this free agent market to do a lot more than they did. No, they didn't have to go get Garrett Cole, and they did get Zach Wheeler, and he was a guy that was coveted by a lot of teams. More on what people think he can do rather than what he has done in the past. So we'll see how that turns out. But there were just even guys like the Braves that go Julio Teheran. A guy like that, just pick somebody up like that with experience. I don't know why they didn't go get even, some of those second-tier guys to bolster this rotation. Instead, they're relying on a couple things. One is for Jake Arrieta to be healthy. If he is and he's his old self, then now you got a really formidable rotation. But that's a big if. And now the bigger ifs are you're relying on Vince Velasquez, Zach Eflin, and Nick Pivetta. Huge ifs. I mean, and maybe it happens, but there were better options than to rely on huge ifs.
So if this is Hangover 3, is it Pivetta and Velasquez that wake up with the tiger in their room, or is it's those guys, right, that we're talking about who really have to make the jump forward, right? They are, Nola and Wheeler. You know how the Phillies think of them. They think they've got as good a 1-2 as any in the division, and I'm sure Mike Rizzo's down there in Washington going, Strasburg, Scherzer. Oh, and by the way, Pat Corbin. I mean, they run a pretty good 1-2-3 out there.
And Anibal Sanchez.
And whoever the Mets manager is right now is saying the same thing.
Is saying, DeGrom, Syndergaard, Matz, Stroman. It just seems like not only are those rotations as strong at the top, if not stronger, but they are deeper 3 through 5 or 3 through 7, because we all know you need more than 5. So, like Pivetta, Velasquez, Eflin, do you believe in any of them? Do you believe in any of them being lasting members of a playoff-bound rotation?
I believe in Zach Eflin probably the most out of the three of them because he has the track record, or the most successful track record of the three of them. But I believed in him as a 5, and I think he would have been perfect for that. But now you're bumping him up to the 4, and now you're bringing Pivetta and Velasquez in. So now Zach Eflin is that much more important. Where you could get by with if he was just as good as he was last year as your 5, that's fine. But now that he's the 4, he's that much more important because your 5 is that much more shaky. And I think that's the problem. Like you said, these teams in the division, not only are they better at the top, they're much, much better at the bottom of the rotation. I think that's a huge difference.
I think one of the things the Phillies are looking at and expecting is that at some point this season, Spencer Howard is going to be in their rotation. It's another if, but he's the guy they really believe can become quickly a top 3 part of the rotation, you know, rather than he's just not coming to fill the 5 hole. He's coming to be a difference maker in the rotation. But when does that happen? I don't know.
And the question too with him is not only when does it happen, and is he a true major league pitcher, but also how much can he give you? Because we're talking about somebody who threw about 100 innings last year.
Right.
So they're going to have to be careful about how they.
You know, they're going to have him on an innings count.
They're going to have him on an innings count. How many? What's he going to have left when he does come to the big leagues? Is he more of a guy who you use out of the bullpen in the big leagues this year when he gets there, and then next year becomes his real first breakthrough into the rotation? Or, given the volume that he's had so far on his arm, can you get anything out of him as a starting pitcher?
It gets talked about less, but you know the question also exists: do they have enough in the bullpen? You know, I don't know if the answer to that question is yes either. You know, they got Naris. They're not going to have Robertson.
They have enough bodies.
They got a ton of bodies, and you know, yes, a lot of those kids that we saw at their winter thing down at the ballpark had great seasons. But it's one thing to have a great season at AA and AAA to make that jump and be a big, and that's what they need. That's really, if the Phillies don't get the things that they are counting on, they're going to be a 4th place team again.
It's also one thing to have a major league track record like Drew Storen or Francisco Liriano, and it's another thing to have the majority of that track record being in 2015 and 2016, not a whole lot the last few years. So they took an approach this year with regard to the bullpen where they just threw a bunch they're throwing a bunch of flyers out there, and they've gotten a lot of bites on the bullpen. They're bringing in a lot of guys as non-roster guys with the opportunity to win jobs. I wonder if that was their intention with the rotation as well, beyond signing, you know, they signed Wheeler, that was their big one. I wonder whether they thought that there would be more Julio Terrans left at the end of the offseason to sort of throw these flyers at, and there just wasn't in the starting pitching market the way there was in the bullpen market.
It's a great question. I bet it wasn't there, and now they're left with what they're left with. You know.
And why are they fishing in the non-roster invitee market right now?
Because they don't want to go over the luxury tax.
Thank you.
At least not yet. And they may want to do that in July at the trade deadline, but I'll remind you that costs players. You're going to have to make player trades to get those guys. It's going to be more than just going over. If you were going to go over in July, you could have gone over in the offseason. And we'll have plenty of time to talk more about the luxury tax and the implications thereof in terms of what they're bringing to spring training as we get to Clearwater and start spring training. So please check us out in the pages of the Philadelphia Inquirer and at inquirer.com.